South Dakota. That's why, if you look at your credit card, if your credit card company is chartered in either Delaware or South Dakota. MBNA was chartered in Delaware. They've actually been bought by Bank of America. We're not as concerned about Joe Biden's links to MBNA as we are of Tim Johnson's links to Citibank. In fact, we call him Senator Citibank in the office. And that's because Tim Johnson is the head of the Senate Banking Committee. That is an incredibly powerful committee that deals with all of the issues we work on. And in fact, we thank our lucky stars that Chris Dodd stayed around long enough to pass the Credit Card Act and financial reform, because that would not have happened, I think, my personal opinion, if Tim Johnson was the head of the banking committee. And I guess the bigger context is, these kind of relationships and backstories matter. They're a little bit complicated to explain, and sometimes they don't get out there. If anybody asked us, we'd be happy to tell them, and I'm glad somebody asked. So, and then we got one more question about how is the work of Elizabeth Warren being analyzed and assessed, and the word from consumer advocates is terrific.
Great, thank you.
Sorry. Okay, I got a couple of good questions as well. One is, whatever happened to the concept of public service messages to counter the propaganda? Is this a question of funding? Well, that's both a question and an answer. Yes. I think it's not just the funding. One issue is that I think that a lot of advertisers now disguise themselves as organizations that are concerned about public service. It's almost impossible to tell which is which. And we just saw one example of that. But another example is these credit repair, bankruptcy, counseling ads. I see them every day. I don't watch that much television, but I see them constantly. And they all sound like they are representing one of the consumer advocate groups that really does help people with credit issues. But many of them are just scam artists. But listening to their messages, there would just be no way to be able to tell the difference. So the long answer to that question is that it's just too confusing. And so there are lots of public service announcements out there, and there are lots of organizations that are sponsoring them. Of course, they don't have the resources that many of these other firms do, these private firms. Some of them don't have consumers' best interest at heart. And so it definitely is a funding issue. But I think it's also a messaging issue as well. I mean, the message, be careful who you trust, okay, that's great. But that's not really all that compelling, given the fact that none of us trust anybody that has anything to do with the lending industry anymore. So that's my answer to that one. Another question I got was, what role do you see what role did scapegoating of minority groups during this economic recession play into all of this? And all I want to say about that is that early on, this really was a story about the minority populations and minority communities, and it very much started out in minority communities. And so the coverage in the media and what economists were all focused on had to do with that. And for those of us who studied those issues, that was easy. We jumped on that, we sort of understood that, and that was that. Well, it didn't take very long before it became abundantly clear that this was not necessarily an issue that was exclusive to minority communities. It didn't have anything to do with CRA. It was all sorts of other kinds of silly hypotheses that people threw out. But one thing that we do know now is that it really had nothing to do with any particularly unique characteristics of minority communities or lower income people or people who weren't all that terribly educated, but it had everything to do with a system that had incentives to provide things that were bad for people. And I think that's the bottom line there.
5 minutes to answer.
Okay, I won't be able to answer them all. A whole set of questions were addressed the question about why particular stories weren't covered. And there were some quite good questions. For instance, one was about the chief economist for the BIS in 2002. It was very clear that we were headed for a financial disaster. And the question, you know, basically, why wasn't that covered? This person had spoken to them, and the story wasn't covered. I think there are many other examples of stories that should have been covered that weren't. And I think one of the difficulties the press has is making something of a story. So the question is that one person thinks we're headed to a financial disaster, doesn't make it, often it's hard to make that a story. Now, that should have been followed up, and this was this chief economist of the BIS, which is one of the major international financial institutions. But, you know, it goes back to some of the things I made before, that the press doesn't want to you know, most people will say, things are going great, why do you want to write a story that's negative? Another reason why a lot of these stories don't get covered is illustrated by another question, which is there have been large numbers of little stories about misbehavior in the foreclosure process, paperwork. The problem is it's sort of a drip, drip, drip. No single story event is enough to paint a picture. But then when you want to paint the whole picture, they say, well, there's no news here. We all know about that. And so for the press, you want to have an article that's news, but the little stories themselves are not as damning as the big picture. And I think it's often difficult to do that. A third example of this is, if you look in the Financial Inquiry Commission, they really uncovered some really interesting stories that were never discussed in the media. One example, for instance, is the U.S. government hired the Goldman Sachs lawyer to negotiate with AIG. Well, the argument was a very compelling one. He knew a lot about the case. But you might have thought that there might be some conflicts of interest, and, you know, and I think it was scandalous, but it was not very well covered, or if it covered at all, in the media. So these are, you know, and they might say, well, it wasn't newsworthy. It's in a book. Anybody can go out there. It's not a news story that we broke. Now, one example, there's one example of something that I think really did make it, and it illustrates the general point that a well-written, a well-done story can do well, and that's the movie Inside Job. And so one of the questions I got has been, what has been the effect of the Inside Job in the economics department B School at Columbia? Now, as you know, there was a rivalry between Columbia and Harvard about who had the most stars in that movie. And in this particular case, Columbia does cede victory to Harvard. They did have more people that starred, and I could have nominated a number of other characters that they didn't have time for to put in the movie that could have been big players from Harvard in that particular movie. The answer, though, is, besides embarrassment, remarkably little. And that's the broader. It did have a little bit of an impact on the economics profession. There was a discussion about whether there should be a code of conduct. But I think the general sense was, no, that would be infringing on free markets. So I don't think, at least I haven't heard of any significant movement towards a code of conduct, but maybe I'm wrong on that. But that really does illustrate that if you do something well, it does get the story across, and film is a very effective media for getting these stories across. Just as an aside, In terms of the university reactions, again, they're very, very little reaction, and that's sort of consistent. One of the Harvard professors who was engaged in a previous scandal involving corruption in Russia, we sent somebody over to teach them rule of law, and they used that as an opportunity to engage in insider trading. Harvard got engaged in, got fined a very substantial amount. This person got fined, legal bills, and we're talking about tens of millions of dollars here. And the punishment on the part of Harvard of this particular professor was to take away the name of his professorship, but leave him to continue his professorship and his salary unchanged. Yeah, Institutional Investor covered that, the longest story that they have ever published. And so that was a real example of a story coming out at the right time. It did have a very big impact on the president of the university at that time, who had defended this particular instance of corruption as saying that it gave him an insight into the nature of corruption so he could write about it more effectively. No, that was a joke. Let me just make two more comments, okay? One of them is about a question about too big to fail banks. And it says, if a bank is too big to fail, is it not too big to remain a private profit-making, i.e. Nationalize these banks instead of bailing them out? Well, what I want to point about here is how language has played a very big role, and that's true in a lot of the discussion. And again, the media needs to be a little bit more active in thinking about the language. So the word nationalization has certain connotations in the United States. If they used another word that actually is just as descriptive, which is ordinary rules, conservatorship, or bankruptcy, or, you know, all of these are usual procedures when you can't pay your creditors. You're supposed to shut down the institution. And then something happens. You have Chapter 11. In banks, we have a procedure that's like Chapter 11 or like bankruptcy. We just call it a conservatorship. If they had used that word, and we would have realized that we were actually suspending the rules of capitalism when we bailed them out. And that is a different way of characterizing the same thing. But the advisors of Obama wanted this to be characterized as nationalization, because that way the choice was between acting like one of those Scandinavian countries, which actually managed their bailout, their restructuring of their bank very well, and the economy recovered, and the United States, which managed it extraordinarily badly, and we have still not recovered. And then the final question, I thought, a number of questions about economics more generally. In the aftermath of the crisis in Europe, there was a lot of discussion of a new capitalism, a lot of discussion about something was wrong with the market model. And we need to think about the rules of the game. And this was, and actually the political leaders, people like Sarkozy on the right, talked about that the crisis showed that something was wrong with the way our system worked. And that was not meant to be a statement that we ought to move away from a market economy, but it was a statement that the rules, our current rules, the way we run today, are not ideal, and we ought to be thinking about fundamental reforms. What's so interesting is that has not happened in the United States, and the press has not really taken an active role in saying, you know, something went wrong, and the rules of the game are really, there's something peculiar about the way we run our economy. So this is a deeper point. It goes to the basic premises of Friedmanite economics. It goes to the premises of how economies function. And that discussion of what are the bases of well-functioning economies, I think ought to still be discussed, because obviously the economy is not back working like it should. And the final interesting question, there are lots of interesting questions. The final one shows the conflicts of interest that we all have. And the question says, because most of us have a substantial amount of our money in stocks, now, most of us is actually not true. 50% of Americans have no financial assets, but probably most of the people here probably do. Anyway, most of, and they often indirectly do through pension funds, which they're not really fully aware of. Doesn't that make many of us environmental advocates ambivalent about attacking corporations that are both polluting and providing us without retirement funds? Well, I think it does illustrate the mixed roles that all of us as citizens are in, and that fortunately I think most of us really do separate our roles, and even if we have pension funds that own BP, or even if we have are adversely affected privately, we understand, try to separate out our role as citizens. But the interesting thing, again from the press, was the coverage of the BP spill in the UK versus the United States. Because BP is the largest corporation, it's about 10%, I think, of the capitalization stock market in the UK, and they took a very defensive role, interpretation of the BP spill. So this issue of interest is always going to be there, even when it's not just the company itself. As citizens, we wind up inevitably getting brought into this nexus.
I was asked to repeat the name of some of the websites that we like, so I'll just do that quickly. CreditWriteDowns.com, and it's Naked Capitalism, right, or Capitalist. And Dean's website, The Audit, globalpost.com, globalvoices.com. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Okay. CreditWriteDowns.com, The Daily Audit, which is Dean's website, globalpost.com, Global Voices.